Okay, so Dr. Adele LaFrance and Dr. Joe Tafour, we are live streaming now on YouTube, and then we will have this as a body kindness podcast. I just wanted to say thank you so much for giving me your time today and having a conversation about a topic that is actually very new to me. We are going to be talking about emotion coaching, emotion-focused family therapy, and psychedelics. So I'm so honored and thrilled. I know you are the best in leading edge here. So listeners are in for a real treat. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, Rebecca.
So I just wanted to start by letting the viewers know a little bit more about how I came to want to have a conversation with you. And Adele, it starts with you. I heard about your work from a fellow dietitian. And the second I heard it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is up my alley. Where can I sign? Like, take my money, give me all the trainings. And so I was very lucky. I did a 2-day workshop that you offered. I want to say it was in June. And it was on emotion-focused family therapy and emotion coaching. And it was like, within the first hour and definitely by the end, it was this, where has this been all my life? This is such an important tool for healing. And it seemed so simple, almost like this is too easy. It's too simple. And I could also imagine, how difficult it could be, not necessarily to learn, but just to implement and to build your confidence around it. And so the first thing that I wanted to say is that for any, listener who might be working on a healing journey, helping a family member heal, or if you're a helping professional, emotion coaching and emotion-focused family therapy is really powerful. That includes if you're, a dietitian, you identify as a helping professional, certainly therapists. I would argue that, physicians, that there's a broad scope of folks who could really benefit from this. And just briefly, so folks can see and hear about and get these links in the show notes, you do have a couple of books that I bought right away that I'm working my way through. I have 2 young kids, and I have an older daughter who has a diagnosed anxiety disorder. So we've had therapy and friendship groups, but this book has provided so many useful and meaningful tools and how we parent and meet our kids' needs and parent differently. And then for helping professionals, I've really loved really digging into this valuable research and resources that you offer. So deep bow of gratitude to you and your work. And it was actually you who introduced me to Dr. Tafour, and his work is mind-blowing. I have to say, it was like drugs, I grew up in the "this is your brain on drugs" era. And so let's talk about that and debunk some of the stigma and myths around it. But with that, I would love, to pivot to just, what else would you like viewers to know a little bit more about you and your work to ground the conversation? And then let's just go for it.
Me or me?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what I'd like people to know about is that I've been focused on healing, deep healing, and trying to find out what is going to work for people. So you got the emotion-focused therapies. Mm-hmm. They're showing that, hey, this just talking about things and the cognitive side doesn't always make progress, with people. So mm-hmm. It's about, sometimes they need to get deeper. And that first stage is maybe in their emotional, journey, mm-hmm. really deeper into their emotional life, their past life, their past, mm-hmm. their traumas, mm-hmm. all that kind of stuff, and working through that. And so then now the psychedelic therapies, I have my background working with ayahuasca and plant medicines in South America. Mm-hmm. The psychedelic therapy seemed to amplify the potential of that kind of work. Mm-hmm. And there's no question about that, about the breakthroughs that are happening in psychedelic research and psychiatry with PTSD, with anxiety, now with the new areas they're looking at addiction, depression, things like that, problems that we struggle with so much. And that's how we came to, connect was just, eating disorders, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a medical doctor, and the attitude towards that when I was coming through training was, hey, these people, there's not much we can do. And so it's about bringing this other dimension to it, the emotional dimension to their healing. And, even for me, spiritual dimension as well,
Mm-hmm.
bringing those elements. And then you see progress start happening for individuals.
Right. And Adele, it reminds me of in your training when you talk about the blocks.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Right. And so is that where we might pivot, like maybe get a foundation for emotion coaching and sort of how these two might blend when we reach a block in our cognitive work?
Yeah. So the idea here is like I did some research a number of years ago to understand why parents and caregivers of children with mental health issues sometimes acted in ways that weren't helpful or were obstructive or were accommodating or enabling. And I couldn't understand what was going on. And, in our rounds, we would talk about like, oh, this parent just doesn't get it, or this parent's just not motivated to help the child. They're enmeshed, they're benefiting from the illness somehow. All these theories that were didn't sit well with me because I was trained in a humanistic perspective where fundamentally we are all good. And so how does that kind of match up? So I started learning more about emotion focused techniques, about emotion science, and in particular, Dan Siegel's work really inspired me because he would talk about the fact that when emotion is high, you can't access logic, reasoning, problem solving abilities, capacities to learn, or even your fund of knowledge that you've already acquired. And so I started kind of applying those models to the parenting world. And our research did show that what was more likely to lead to caregivers engaging in problematic patterns of support were fears that something bad would happen to their kid, or shame, that they would somehow find themselves to be a bad parent or they would be judged by others. And so if we could help them with their fear, touch into their fear, talk about their fear, embody their fear, move through their fear, then organically they were able to be parenting from a place of instinct. Likewise, if we touched into their shame or their self-blame, for things that they wish they would have done, or any narrative of, self-blame that they carried, and we didn't reassure them. We couldn't reassure them. We couldn't say that it's not your fault. We tried that for years. Like, oh, this bad thing happened in your family's life. Not your fault, not your fault. Doesn't work. Like that doesn't transform deep shame or self-blame. You have to get through it. So we would encourage them to talk to us about the worst of it, and support them through it. And then that's how emotions change, is that once you get to the depth of one emotion, another more adaptive emotion naturally arises, which then therefore creates a place or a space within their psyche, within their soul, where they can parent from a place of love, of instinct. So that was probably the most exciting for me, research, because then we could say like, no, there's no such thing as an unmotivated parent who doesn't get it. There's a parent who's terrified of making a misstep that might be worse, or who's terribly self-blaming, for difficulties that have happened, and we can help them.
It really is powerful because you're right. I have experienced that thread a lot where it's like, as a clinician, you're noticing something isn't working. And
Yeah.
I think it could be our own shame that then triggers this blame. Well, they're non-compliant or they're not. And it is so judgmental, right? Like if you think of empathy from their side of things, where are you saying that I'm broken or this isn't going to work for me or it's hopeless? And I love how you talked about that did not feel good to me. From a humanistic standpoint, if we are all good, right? We're dealing with traumas, like we have problems. If we could get to why do we need this protection, right? From the eating disorder or other behaviors that we have that we would like to heal from, right? What is underneath that could help, bring us free. And I think when clinicians don't have the answers, we're kind of in this, but I'm supposed to heal. I'm supposed to have the answers. And it's our own shame and blame, right? That then keeps us, from truly helping them, when we look at I guess, people as problems. And that's what I loved about doing the training and getting the resources, that it did offer an alternative, right? But that I deeply believed in, which is common humanity and a genuine goodness and shame resilience. And so I really think it's powerful. And I would love to get a little bit more into the concept of blocks
Yes.
and psychedelics. I think that would be really interesting to try to talk about. So what would you like to say about that?
I would just like to jump off what you were just saying real fast, that this idea, what she was just talking about, how people have a harder time, and what you know, also added in on a harder time being rational or making, you know, wise decisions about their, you know, when they get emotional. And then you were just talking about how the clinician then is exhibiting that behavior. And so then one of the issues behind all this is that in the system is that if the healer, the provider, the healthcare provider is not educated and advised that they need to work through that stuff, that actually that's going to make it difficult for them to be compassionate. If they don't work through that stuff for themselves, when they get triggered, they're going to become judgmental and they're going to leave things how they are and walk away because things are too much. So that's what we see a lot of, because that's not really part of the training, you know, of this bringing this thing to the core of like, this is how when working with human beings, this emotional side is inescapable. It's fundamental. Like it is what inspires and motivates people. It is what leads to, you know, without getting carried away, but you know, the political situation, and it's like, oh, it's so irrational. This is how people are. This is what people do. So you have to get at, you know, what it is. And so if you have a training that doesn't really have you look at your own emotional blocks, let's say, or even if you hit those, you don't walk away. Because why? Because it's not a situation right now, I think, in the professional environment where people feel comfortable being vulnerable enough to go there and feel supported, and that they're not going to be judged because of what we just talked about.
Yeah.
So you need a non-judgmental environment for these emotional blocks to be addressed. So once the blocks, you know, or whatever you want to call them, you could talk about it as like triggers, things, situations in which you get triggered, and then you find yourself in this, you know, altered state, dysfunctional state, not at your best, you know, not in your higher self, however you want to call it. So it's, how do you discover those? How do you figure out where those are? And so a lot of times people, that's what they struggle with. And so sometimes in the right setting with responsible use, you know, the psychedelic therapies, even sacred plant medicines can help people. Like we say, you know, there's the part we see and there's the part we don't see. So that's where the mental cognitive problem is. If we want to focus on the mental cognitive side, there's the part we see and there's the part we don't see. How do you see that part? You know, whether it's repressed memories or just stuff, parts of your psyche or your body that are just overwhelmed by trauma, or just even little things that just built up to the point where you just scarred it over and you have blinders in those areas. How do you see that? You know, how do you open yourself up to that? Especially in a society like we were just talking about, where there's a judgment and there's all these things discouraging that kind of perspective. So the psychedelics can help open people's minds to be aware of that thing, open their minds up again, to feel the things that are there that they have cut themselves off from. They've turned the switches off to those feelings. It can open that up and allow people to start processing again the things that they've kind of shut down from.
Yeah. You know, I think the most common question at this point, just for being human, is, does it work? And so what kind of examples, like if you could kind of walk through, like, I can't imagine someone, maybe they could log on and be like, I want a therapist who can give me MDMA, you know, like where are we right now? What's the data? Cause I'm bought in with this idea of, you know, it exactly lines with trauma. We suppress things for protection for a reason, but actually we need to bring those things back up to heal. And our brain is our brain. And really what we're talking about is being able to work with a trauma brain. And it's looking like in research that psychedelics can help us access things that we couldn't access. So it's really a tool for healing and liberation and freedom. But it's, if it were already in place, we wouldn't be talking about this as cutting edge work. So where are we at right now? What kind of data do we have? Anecdotes? Like, what can you share?
I mean, with ayahuasca, it's really not new. Ayahuasca's been used in ceremonial contexts for a very long time in indigenous traditions. And so we're at this phase now where we're starting to kind of pay more attention to and pay more respect to indigenous healing practices, that we can actually integrate into our world now as it is. There are a number of other studies that have been coming up, in the last number of years related to MDMA and LSD, and psilocybin is, really, really experiencing a research boom right now. And I guess and so there's lots of preliminary data to show that there's great promise, but we have to be really careful because it's still early days. And one thing that we are learning is that set and setting really is significant. I mean, it's been talked about for years, but it really, really is important for someone to be really ready for this kind of experience and to be able to have an experience in a setting where they feel safe and where they are resourced, so not just internal resource, but external resource, social support, and integration support, depending on, where they're from and what kind of help they have. But the other thing I would say about, the potential for psychedelics is it's not just for healing, it's also for learning. Like one of the things that people don't know about my work with EFFT is that a lot of the kind of deeper interventions are actually very much informed by my experiences with ayahuasca, where I was having these like really powerful healing moments for myself, or these really massive insights. I'm like, oh my gosh, this needs to be translated, And so a lot of that book, the clinician manual, is actually influenced by what I learned from these sacred plant medicines. So, it's really exciting to think about how there can be an interchange, not just around healing, but around learning how to live, in this world of ours.
Dr. Tafour, could you share more about the like what would you want us to know? And I believe you have a book as well, but about the long history of psychedelics and indigenous medicine. And, I mean, my ancestors, came to the United States as, settlers or whatever the words. And so I'm aware of Western medicine, and we can appropriate indigenous practices. And at least where I'm at in my journey, I also want to be very respectful in being a learner and crediting the ancestors and healers. And, how can we be respectful and help to move things forward? So is that something that you could talk about in terms of your work and resources and what we should know? Is I'm imagining that most of, my listeners are mostly involved in the Western medicine realm.
Sure. Well, just to like kind of go a little bit off of what you're both saying and then lead into that, is that like you're asking about studies and things, and just to give you an idea, like as a medical doctor, and when is this stuff going to come out? When are you going to have MDMA psychotherapy available? You were asking, there's preliminary studies, but they're piling up on the MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. So the criteria to enter the study, because it's the controversial psychedelic, drug thing like you're talking about, is you have to be treatment resistant to get into the study. So nothing's worked for these people. So the average duration of treatment resistant chronic PTSD of these people is 18 years from the first batch of data, usually around the 2-decade range. So we're talking 20 years of treatment resistant. And I'm saying everything you've tried doesn't work. All this Western, what we were just talking about, this perspective, it's not working for these people. So it's really from a very deeply compassionate place that people are really trying to explore these things. They have family members so these are not just combat veteran type people, of sexual abuse victims. The list goes on and on. So that's really the deep motivation behind the people who are really trying to do this work and really trying to help. So MAPS, their study, has led to a FDA breakthrough category. They're saying this is the biggest. They're having, of those people at 6 months follow-up, nearly 70% no longer have PTSD.
Wow.
So you go from 20
after 20 years. I'm hearing this 20 years, and it sounds like I don't know if torture is the right word, but it sounds like a really long time to have to suffer
Sounds like that we're
unnecessarily.
all aware of, like Vietnam
Yeah.
veteran, that was in the late 60s. Everybody knows that these people, sexual abuse victims, their whole life. So this is decades long, for everyone and for
It's
people that they know and in
70%
their family.
healing. And
And
how long
then
was the
close to that,
study?
like 60 something, but it's just like it's transformational, it's
Mhm.
breakthrough. So the FDA is recognizing that. So they are the first in line. MDMA, assisted psychotherapy, could be available, later this year or next year. That's the timeline. Psilocybin is right behind that. So just to plug back into the other
Right.
side of it is like, well, MDMA actually originally is sourced. They're making synthetic versions from petroleum, but even still, that mostly they still source, and the worldwide use, plant source. And so the original source was the sassafras tree, which is a North American tree. The Native Americans taught the settlers, as we talked about, how to use the root of the sassafras tree to produce saffron oil, which eventually becomes sarsaparilla and root beer, but also becomes sassafras oil, which some people use underground to do this kind of work and otherwise recreationally. And then you can process that one step further and you get MDMA. So the root of this MDMA research here in the United States is Native American culture, and it is from the plants and the trees. So that's really the source of all so we have the psilocybin stuff we've been talking about, that, okay, that's the other one that's had a lot of big research studies with it for end of life anxiety and their beginning depression research. That's, the Mazatec culture from Mexico, and southern Mexico. They were the ones that opened that tradition to the, people coming down there in the 60s and the 50s and showing people about mushrooms, and so that turned into everything that it became. Meanwhile, their culture is stably still working with that stuff. They didn't have to have freak out and have a war on drugs and then have a psychedelic renaissance and come back around. They've just been going. They've already been through that process that we're just coming to now, about how do you use these things respectfully, how do you use these things responsibly, how can you use these things for healing. And so then it just goes on and on as far as the other ones. We have Iboga from West Africa that is leading to the production of ibogaine, which is showing like really incredible potential to help people come off of opiates, to overcome opiate withdrawal and be able to come off and have an opportunity to try to heal while they're not fighting through withdrawal symptoms, which is obviously a major crisis in our country. So those are three big examples. And then there's there's the other one. So there's LSD research and that stuff that's coming out of a different tradition. And then there's ketamine, which is, to be honest, is coming out of, like I've been talking about, out of the medieval, like European alchemical chemistry, that whole tradition that has its roots in tinkering around and Merlin and all that stuff, and learning about laboratory and chemistry, and that's evolved into what is today the production of ketamine, which is a big thing that's being used in psychotherapy, that people are having psychedelic experiences, even though it was previously used in anesthesia. So it's all rooted. And so it's important. And that's one last thing I want to say, amidst everything that we're going through. And I brought it up last night that somebody mentioned to me, is that, one of the issues here in this country that we struggle with is because of what you just talked about, the settlers and kind of the wipeout, or and it's not completely wiped out at all, but the heavy, degradation of the native culture and the cutting of ancestral roots to the land here, that it leads to a lot of kind of potential for just a lack of connection to wisdom in the culture. You don't have that experience to draw from like you do in other parts of the world, where they're rooted. They know that, the nature where they're from is where their ancestors came from. And it's a different kind of way to be connected to that. So I think it's extremely important that we reconnect and align ourselves with some of the native wisdom here in this land. I think it could really help root the culture, because we have fallen behind a little bit in that area.
Right. And I just want to correct myself with an apology, because I knew settlers coming out. I'm like, that's not the word you identify, Rebecca. What's the word? And anyway, so colonizers is what
I think it's, I understand what you mean. That is what we call it.
Yeah.
And we know that, that not every one of them was as aggressive but they were part of that. Yes. No question that the settling of America involved very aggressive treatment of the Native Americans.
Yeah.
And so everyone participated in that to some degree. And yet many people were just trying to get away from wherever they're trying to go and settle somewhere. And so it's a tough situation. It's a delicate topic, you know,
It
but I
is.
think,
I'm thinking of with just the recent, peaceful transfer of power here in the United States. So I live in Washington, D.C. My husband works in network news, usually assigned to the Capitol. He was in Delaware, so he wasn't in the Capitol during the insurrection, thank goodness. But we're right now, a lot of the narrative that we're hearing about is that you can't have unity and healing without the accountability piece. And I think it does relate to what we're talking about now, because the words do matter. And I would say that it's a white supremacist ideal that we know we're participating in, but in this ideal that we take it as if it's ours. Right. And so I do think that what we're talking about is respect for the indigenous cultures and wisdom, and that there is a way, we are in these positions of power and what we know and what we can do to help people, because of our white supremacist roots. And also there is a way where we can, honor, learn from, pay, respect, and amplify, the work that was done before, and collaborate and center, with the respected indigenous healers in moving this work forward, and just stop that big problem of taking and repurposing. So I think it is important to expand it, to that level. What other resources do you offer that might help folks learn and grow in this area?
me,
Yeah.
well, I have my book, Fellowship of the River, Medical Doctors, Exploration of the Traditional Amazonian Plant Medicine, which is about not just about traditional Shipibo healing techniques with ayahuasca and other plants in the Amazon, but it's about why people come from this culture, like you're talking about. Well, let's say the white supremacist, whatever you want to call it, but the white diaspora, you know what I mean? The people who comes to that place, it was people from Europe, people from the United States, people from Australia, primarily. That's the largest percentage of people coming to seek help from indigenous healers. So the question is, what are they not getting in their culture back home? Why are they seeking help from an outside culture? And so that's this whole culture bridge work that you're bringing up. And so the book is about that journey. So it's not necessarily about people just coming to drink ayahuasca or even doing psychedelics, but it's like, guess what? You need to find in your culture what we started this conversation with, a way to address the emotional dimension of life. And I would go as far to say the spiritual dimension as well.
Yeah.
Those two elements, that's what's missing in the healthcare system. That's why people are going down there. And so that book is about that journey and using that in the stories and trying to be, interesting, and anecdotes about big healings that happened through that process. And then I have a class, the River Course, that is based on the book. That's an 8-week course for healthcare providers, for therapists and doctors, which expands on all those ideas. That's going to roll out. And the next one's rolling out in March. We have this, we have this program that we're doing. Come to that. But yeah, we're doing our program February 6th, which is going to be promoted here through this, which is the beginning of that discussion. And for me, then I'm going to go, with the healthcare providers and stuff with the River Course. Those are my two main things. And then I lead trips when the COVID's not booming, down to walk people through the experience.
Oh my gosh. I have my dose 1 vaccination. I'm a healthcare worker being a dietitian, and I have continued to see people as safely as possible in person, like outside and things like that. I have healthcare worker clients and adolescents who, as I know, Adele, as you know, like them getting to see another human has been healing. So as a traveler, I mean, I'm like, book, course, and then take me with you. Where are we going? Because you can learn so much from those powerful experiences. So I'll be sure to include all those links to that great work. And I do want to bring it back to a little bit of practical with respect to the events, because we kind of start in the practical, went high level and back down to practical. What it sounds like the urgency is we know that there's structural problems within the mental health world. When we talked about, it's not even there in the training. I agree. That's why you need CEs, you need books, you need to encourage yourself. You need to question, where are the gaps in my own practice? What makes me unhappy in my own practice? And go out and get that information. And while we're in COVID, I know, Adele, you're offering lots of trainings and virtual webinars and, always very busy. And that to me is a rational first step. And then I think there's probably more we could do with where are we members and how can we offer influence to actually change the structure. But what can you offer as far as tips for practical approaches? And I'd love to know if something's for healthcare helping pros, and if there's anything for families. Maybe we could do one and then the other one.
Yeah, for healthcare professionals, I think that it's really important to cultivate a practice of self-care, but more so of spirituality. When I first started doing emotion-focused work and research, I didn't include spirituality at all. It wasn't part of my life. In fact, I didn't really have a spiritual practice. And the more I learned, the more I did the work experientially, the more I realized that actually, in terms of protecting ourselves from burnout, that is one of the best practices, and from an emotion focused perspective, burnout is related to helping, but feeling like your efforts aren't effective or aren't meaningful, and spirituality can really, really make a big difference. And then I'm not saying you have to go to church every Sunday to be spiritual. I mean, there are so many ways to be spiritual, connecting with nature, for example, and you can do that safely in these times of COVID, even in your backyard, like I'm not even joking. Sometimes I go outside and just hug a tree, and I'm like, seriously, like I just feel like my nervous system starts to calm. Like you can't underestimate the power of nature, and also spirituality, depending on how you see those two things connected. So, and I really do encourage people to consider going to trainings or workshops during this time. There's a bit more time, a bit more flexibility. And certainly in EFFT, we do a whole module on clinician blocks with compassion, because we don't want to be judgmental about our judgment. I mean, I've been super judgmental over the years about people and clients, organizations, and it's just a pathway towards self-healing, because it's like Joe said, it's a trigger. It's like, okay, what unhealed part of myself is showing up, in this judgmental way? Like last night, I was being judgmental about a group, and afterwards I'm like, okay, that's a pathway that I need to go look at. Actually, I'll send you a link for the show notes about a little online, it's 7 minutes, and it's a process of emotional self-explorations that you can do some of that trigger work at home. But the idea is you don't want to see it as like more work, like burdensome. It's actually they're acts of self-love. They're acts of care, so that we can, come to a place of more wholeness. And this year's been a really, really tough year for people. So that's what I would suggest.
That's very powerful. I have years ago when I first started my practice, I was like, just Google it, see what you see. And I found one. It was their website that sold old airplane equipment. And so I have an airplane oxygen mask, and I'll pull it out and I'll drop it. And, there's a big laugh and then like a little slump in the chair, and they'll hold it, and just they're holding it. I was like, what are you feeling? And they'll repeat the phrase. And so they know that feeling of secure your mask and this idea of self-care. And it brings up that feeling of it's selfish. And there's all kinds of cultural reasons why that is. But I think you're so spot on in the sense of what I really think about like self-care is also that it is community care and collective well-being. And that's another, it's not very American of us and our sort of individualism versus collectivism. But I think that we need to go in that direction. And yeah, today it might be going in your backyard, smelling the air and hugging your tree, but notice how you feel.
Right. Or barefoot on the ground.
Yeah.
Like any of those things. It's really, really important.
Yeah. And then, like you said, go deeper. And certainly I think hit that idea. But the second we hear spiritual, I think that we think church, pews, Sundays, God, and whether or not I think you're self-rating, where am I on the, spectrum of religion? And I also think that has to do with, our colonized roots, yeah, exactly. And so it's all part of the healing work. And you've given lots of resources, and we're going to include in the show notes between the books and the webinars and events, so that we can connect and check in, with both of you. Any sort of last words of wisdom or powerful encouragement you would like to offer, to the universe at this time?
I mean, I'll only say one more thing about like advice or whatever. And it's something that is a work in progress for me. So I'm not saying this as an expert in this field, but I really feel like one of our goals has to be to work less, and that sounds weird, but like seriously, to actually work less, work more meaningfully, which was going to evoke fears around scarcity, fears around money, fears around stability. But I think that part of what's going to help us heal, give us the room to heal, the strength to heal, is that, if we're home more, we're in our communities more, engaging more, like at that level.
I don't know how right it is to use the word workaholism, but like I definitely feel like, at least in the DC, we're all overworked and we're in that burnout phase. But I do think you're right. We highly value productivity as if it's worth giving up everything in our life to produce. And I don't think that's very healing. I think I should have a whole separate podcast on just how throwing yourself in your work is a coping mechanism of avoidance or something like that.
Yeah.
And Dr. Tafur.
That's it.
Yeah.
Then you give everybody that opportunity. You say, okay, here's the freebie. You can just do this, and then you don't have to do the other work. And everyone's going to think it's great if you make a lot of money. The problem is that everyone just ends up sick, So that's the big problem. So of course you need more time. Everybody needs more time. How can you have a local cuisine or a local music form or a local art form or a local dance or a local, any of those things that people do all over the world, if you don't have any time? If your culture is the white elephant party at work, that's like your version of like the Rio Carnival. It's like there's
Here's
just
a gift card.
It takes time. Everything takes time, So then the last thing, my thing along what we're talking about, because you were saying, yeah, I mean, there's all this religious trauma, this idea of church, and there was that song from the inauguration where they're like, if you're not going to church, you're going to hell. They were just this. It was a line of like how polarized people think. Wow. Like we're either like, you're either going to church or you're over here, or you're over here and you think they're going, Yeah. And so there's all this trauma, and we're not talking about people's relationship with what you said, how you feel. What does it feel like to be alive? The sacred, what does that mean to you? What's sacred to you? What are you going to think about when you die? You're going to die. We're all going to die. Everybody that that has been close to that, what do they tell you what it's like? So we have a pretty good idea of what it is that is eating at us, what we want to deal with in this life. And so that's as it relates to emotional health for me, that's one of my like phrases from the book, was just, spiritual well-being is reflected in emotional health. So when these other like traditional forms, Native American forms, other cultural ideas about, what does it mean to be spiritually well? It's like, well, it's reflected in their emotional health. They don't have these blocks. They don't have these triggers. They're not overwhelmed by that stuff. They're not acting crazy. They're coming from a place of love and understanding and compassion, because they're spiritually well. Their emotional health has been addressed.
Yeah. When I can think of everything that has ever helped me, like emotionally, it has been in choosing to pause or to, be calm, or, in immersing yourself in it and allowing yourself that time to like, feel the pressure to participate in our social norms, and also let it sit there and breathe and connect and explore and discover, and not have the answer, but to be open to insight into how different your life could be if you take some risk that you think could be in service of your emotional well-being. So I think it's very powerful. I want to get your book and have you on separately to talk about, because I just feel really connected. I think there's going to be a lot of great wisdom in the book, and I want to look up your course and everything like that. And I just want to thank you both so much for being here. You've got great content for us. And so all those links are going to be in the show notes, and, just a deep bow of gratitude for your time, Dr. Adele LaFrance and Dr. Joe Tafour. It really has been an honor to speak to both of you today.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, Rebecca.